Every family tells stories, but the Finches tell endings. A baby who turns bath time into a symphony. A boy who flies away on a swing that never comes down. A man who crowns himself king the moment he chooses to disappear. These aren't just tragedies, they're rituals, little works of art, carved into memory like headstones. What Remains of Edith Finch is a game about death, but not just any death. It's about death that is performed, observed, and preserved. The question isn't why the Finches die. The question is why they die so beautifully. What Remains of Edith Finch is a critically acclaimed first-person narrative exploration game, developed by Giant Sparrow and published by Annapurna Interactive in 2017. Often described as an anthology of interactive short stories, the game centers on the strange and often tragic deaths of various members of the Finch family. Set within the family's towering labyrinthine home in the forest of Washington State, the player assumes the control of Edith Finch, the last surviving member of the bloodline, as she returns to uncover the stories, secrets, and silent inheritances left behind by her kin. Each room in the house is a kind of reliquary, sealed off, meticulously preserved, and dedicated to the memory of a single relative. These spaces serve as a portal into the past, where the player steps into a highly stylized surreal vignettes that reimagine each character's final moments. The central narrative unfolds through Edith's journal, a final letter written to her unborn child. As the player explores the house and uncovers the circumstances of each family member's death, a lingering ambiguity begins to take shape. Are the Finches truly cursed, as family legend insists? Or is this so-called curse merely a pattern of generational misfortune, marked by mental illness, repression, and the quiet inheritance of grief? This tension forms the thematic spine of the game, encouraging players to interpret the family's tragedies through multiple lenses, mythological, psychological, sociocultural, and existential. But the game offers no answers, only stories. Stories that are strange, beautiful, and fatal. In this way, What Remains of Edith Finch becomes less a mystery to be solved, and more a meditation on the narratives we construct around death. It asks, do the stories we tell about loss bring us peace, or do they trap us in patterns we can't escape? In What Remains of Edith Finch, death is not merely depicted, it is aestheticized and ritualized, adopting a distinct artistic, musical, and symbolic form that fuses narrative with expression. Mortality becomes a medium, not for fear, but for beauty, abstraction, and emotional resonance. Instead of horror or despair, the game approaches death through performance. A child's drowning becomes a surreal ballet, a factory's worker's decapitation is masked by an ascending fantasy kingdom. These moments do not shy away from pain, but they reimagine it, turning private tragedies into expressive, often poetic rituals. Gregory's vignette unfolds as a multisensory aquatic ballet. In the bathtub, the baby's imagination overflows. Frogs leap to rhythm, toys waltz with sea creatures, and the water rises in concert with a swelling score. It is both playful and unimaginably tragic, filled with childlike wonder yet haunted by inevitability. The scene doesn't show drowning, it shows transcendence. Gregory's death is reframed as a final act of joyful immersion, where the line between imagination and reality dissolves in pure rhythm. This is death as a lyrical escape, a composition of innocence and oblivion. In stark contrast, Louis Finch's vignette depicts the quiet horror of detachment. Working at a cannery, his repetitive task of beheading fish is overlaid with the growing fantasy of a heroic kingdom he rules. The player must simultaneously control both realities, one hand on the fish, the other guiding a fantasy self to an ever-expanding world. Here, mechanics mirror mental state, gameplay becomes metaphor. Louis aestheticizes his own suffering into a fantasy so vast it finally consumes him. His death, when it arrives, is staged like a coronation, not a moment of despair but a moment of ornate finality, a beautifully constructed death masked by grandeur. Even mundane objects in the Finch home are imbued with poetic charge. A tent becomes a funeral shroud, a camera flash captures the last living moment, a swing becomes a pendulum between joy and tragedy. These spaces, lovingly preserved, transform everyday items into memento mori, symbols that speak louder than exposition. What makes Edith Finch so resonant is its use of mechanics as meaning. The player's physical actions, spinning knobs, opening diaries, manipulating toys, are not just interactivity, they are emotional rituals. You don't just learn about the death, you perform it, gently, with reverence. Edith, as both narrator and surrogate, guides the player through this ritual. She's not simply exploring a house, she's performing a pilgrimage through grief, unlocking each sealed room like opening the pages of a family's collected myths. In this structure, Edith becomes both chronicler and mourner, not resisting the past but curating it, turning memory into narrative and tragedy into meaning. Death is not feared, it is shaped. So the question arises, in honoring the death so elaborately, are the Finches mourning or the mythologizing? And in doing so, are they celebrating life or aestheticizing its end? This is where we turn to philosophy of Albert Caraco, a writer who saw in civilization's obsession with memory and death not healing, but pathology. Albert Caraco was a Franco-Uruguayan philosopher and writer known for his uncompromising, often apocalyptic worldview. A former diplomat turned metaphysical pessimist, Caraco witnessed firsthand the horror of the 20th century, war, genocide, and the collapse of meaning on a global scale. These are not just influences, they were the foundation of his work. His writing is stark, furious, and deeply intimate. His worldview draws from the bleak lineage of thinkers like Schopenhauer and Kjoren, but where they lamented the absurd, Caraco catalogued its decay. He saw death not as a singular end, but as the central fixation of modern life, a silent god we both fear and serve. Two of his most significant works distill this fatalistic vision: Post-Mortem, a haunting autobiographical meditation on the death of his parents, especially his mother. The text blends grief with metaphysical despair, turning mourning into a philosophical dissection of mortality and human limitation. And secondly, Brevière du Chaos, a furious indictment of modern civilization. Caraco depicts a world hurtling towards collapse under the weight of overpopulation, spiritual rot, and moral exhaustion. In his view, death is not just inevitable, it is our cultural inheritance, the hidden logic behind memory, myth, and progress. Caraco believed that civilization is not built to conquer death, but to distract us from it. In Brevière du Chaos, he argues that our highest rituals, architecture, art, and even family memory do not transcend mortality, they defer it, they aestheticize it, they make it beautiful enough to bear. This vision resonates uncannily with what remains of Edith Finch. The Finch home, with stacked towers and sealed-off rooms, is less a house in a mausoleum, a Gothic museum of curated mortality. Every addition, every memorial, every sealed room adds another layer of reverence to the family's slow vanishing. The house isn't a place for the living, it's a stage for death, designed to look like legacy. Caraco was deeply skeptical of memory's redemptive power. In Post-Mortem, he rejects the idea that remembering heals. For him, memory is not liberation, it's obligation. To remember, he writes, is to become a custodian of decay. This idea finds a dark echo in Edith's own narration. As she walks through her childhood home, her tone is calm, observant, and even poetic. What she's doing is not healing, it's archiving. She does not challenge the myth of the Finch curse, she organizes it. Each memory she recalls becomes fixed, formalized, and ritualized. And perhaps the most chilling of Caraco's aphorisms captures this quite well. To write is to embalm. Edith's journal, written for an unborn child, is presented as a gift, but it may also be a burden. It is a book of death, passed down like a heirloom, a coffin carved from story. And if Caraco gives us philosophy of death as civilization's secret center, then Edgar Allan Poe offers its literary architecture. Where Caraco describes memory as a coffin, Poe builds the coffin into the house itself, brick by brick. Edgar Allan Poe's 1839 short story, The Fall of the House of Usher, recounts the visit of an unnamed narrator to the ancestral mansion of his childhood friend, Roderick Usher. The house, suffused with rot, fog, and gloom, mirrors the slow psychological disintegration of its inhabitants, Roderick and his aiding sister Madeline. Isolated from the world, the Ushers live as though embalmed in their own ancestral myth, suspended in a state of dread and aesthetic decay. As the story unfolds, the house reveals itself as more than a setting, it is a living tomb, a container of familial doom, where architecture and legacy are indistinguishable. The climax arrives when Madeline, prematurely buried, returns in a death-throe trance and collapses into Roderick's arms. At that moment the house itself splits and sinks into the tarn, a literal and symbolic collapse of the bloodline, the body, and the home. In both stories, the house is not just a backdrop, it's a body, a coffin, and a curse. For Poe, the House of Usher physically collapses in tandem with the extinction of the bloodline. In Edith Finch, the house remains standing but grows increasingly grotesque and vertical, a monument to death's long past. Its additions rise like tumors, each room sealed after death, each door locking in memory. The Finch estate does not fall, but it festers, inch by inch, life by life. Roderick Usher, like Edith Finch, is not just surrounded by memory, he is consumed by it. He believes the house is sentient, that its slow decay mirrors his own unraveling mind. Edith too walks through a space so saturated with memory it has become unlivable. Each room she enters is a memory trap, a curated reliquary of trauma, where no one has moved forward, only inward. But neither family is destroyed suddenly, instead they rot with ceremony. But perhaps the most haunting parallel lies in how both families mythologize their decline. Roderick Usher believes the house is killing him. Edith wonders aloud whether her family is cursed. In both cases, belief becomes prophecy. These myths don't merely explain death, they accelerate it. The more the Finches tell themselves they are doomed, the more they live in ways that would push them towards it. The curse is not a supernatural force, it is a story, passed from generation to generation, until living becomes a form of reenactment. We all are going to die. One day. And most people will do so quietly and unremarkably. For most, only a headstone or an urn will remain. But not everything needs to be a monument to endure. Sometimes remembrance is quiet, personal, a small gesture, a story told at the right moment. What Remains of Edith Finch reminds us that even if memory doesn't heal us, well, not completely, it can still shape us. Not by saving the past, but by holding it long enough to understand it, long enough to carry it forward. And, maybe that's the difference between a curse and a legacy. A curse repeats and the legacy transforms. Poe's house sinks beneath the weight of its own bloodline. Caraco's bleak words seal history like a coffin. But Edith's story ends with something neither of them could fully reach. A beginning. A child born into a family of ghosts, but not bound by them. A new life, not untouched by grief, but shaped by it. And still, somehow, willing to step outside the house. Because it's not the ending that makes the story beautiful. It's that someone cared enough to keep retelling it, to carry it forward, to make meaning out of memory. So if we all end up as stories someday, let's try to make them good ones. Not perfect, but honest. Thanks for listening. Take care and goodbye.